Yeah.
Where will I be when I'm talking?
Right here.
Right in that vicinity where
Stand there?
Dr.
Yeah,
Have a lecture?
yes.
Yeah.
He needs a podium or something, or a table of some kind. Do you want to get is there a spare podium? Can we pull it around?
I think they're connected.
Oh, they are. Can we pull this one forward?
Oh, we're live on Facebook now.
Okay.
Okay.
What's this one? Is that too low?
Let's do it.
Dr. Wilkins, are you okay just like maybe sitting at a table or?
Sitting at table would be great. Yeah.
Okay, we're gonna pull this one forward. Here, help me lift it. Dylan, can you tell us if we're perfect or not? Okay.
There you go. The little snippets here. Would you like me to do it?
Wherever you want to do it, yeah.
Okay. Okay.
Alrighty.
There's no sudden movement.
Right, right.
Well, you can do expressive. You can do that.
I'm looking for my wife.
Yeah, have it up.
So that's one of the.
Hmm?
Presentation to show or-
No, I'm just gonna talk.
Cool.
Yeah.
Makes it easy on us.
Yep, I'm very uncomplicated that way.
This feels weird
There you
for
go.
me.
Let me go find my wife. She's got my speech.
Okay.
Excuse me.
Okay. Okay, do you want to give him one of the? And I'll give it, I'll hand it off to you.
Are y'all ready to come fall asleep? Let's go.
What have you got on you?
They gave me a mic thing. Yeah.
Just testing this. Oh, sorry. Sam. Hi, oh my gosh. We're gonna get started now, but I just wanted, yeah. I want to talk to you after this.
Fill that out.
Thank you so
And if
much.
you could just mail check me, get the bank stuff.
Yeah, thank you so
Bank
much.
stuff makes me nervous. I don't trust banks.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Did you want to bring any of your books up here or?
Oh, yeah, I should do that. Yeah.
So what we have to get in-
Nothing. I just wanted to let you know my stuff was here. It's up to you. Okay.
All right. Go ahead
me
and sit
sit
down
down?
and I'll
Okay.
just do a really brief intro.
Alrighty.
Well, might be brief to me. So I think Kayla, we're all set on Zoom. Okay, cool. Okay, everybody. I just want to thank everyone for joining us today. We are at our 7th book talk here at Diné College. As I mentioned in the past is that we're funded through the Mellon Foundation. And we also are really grateful for the support from Diné College for hosting these book talks, as well as these podcasts. So we're really honored to have Dr. David Wilkins join us today. He came in from Richmond, Virginia, to enjoy the beautiful weather today on Tsaile campus. But I just wanted to provide a bit of Dr. Wilkins' background. So Dr. Wilkins is actually a former faculty of Navajo Community College. So he returns to Diné College to share his experience of publishing his 1987 Diné Bibeehaz'áanii, a Handbook of Navajo Government. By the way, guys, we can hear you. So side chatter needs to be probably kept to a minimum. So this book was originally published by Navajo Community College Press. This handbook evolved to become the Navajo Political Experience, currently in its 4th edition and last published in 2013. So the book I'm talking about is the Navajo Political Experience. And
This was the original.
yeah, this is
Right.
the original copy. So I know many of you guys have probably hopped onto Amazon to see if his original book is available. It is not. So it's an out of print book, but if you're lucky enough to get a copy of his first book, hey, scan some copies and send it our way, okay? But David Wilkins is a citizen of the Lumbee Nation and is the E. Claiborne Robbins Distinguished Professor of Leadership Studies at the University of Richmond. He's also the Professor Emeritus of the University of Minnesota, where he held a McKnight Presidential Professorship in American Indian Studies. He earned his PhD in political science from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill in December 1990. Dr. Wilkins is the author and editor of a number of books, including Indigenous Governance, Clans, Constitutions, and Consent, which was just published this year by Oxford University Press. Documents of Native American Political Development, 1933 to present. Red Prophet, The Punishing Intellectualism of Vine Deloria Jr. Dismembered, Native Disenrollment in the Battle for Basic Human Rights with Shelley Wilkins. Is she here?
Over here.
Okay, and Shelley today has actually joined us, David Wilkins' wife. We also have the Hollow Justice, Indigenous Claims Against the United States, the Navajo Political Experience, the Hank Adams Reader, and the Legal Universe. So I haven't read all of these books, but every book I've read of Dr. Wilkins has just been so phenomenal. So I just want everybody to give Dr. Wilkins a warm applause and welcome him to Diné College.
Thank you very much, Wendy. I appreciate it. I'm really happy to be back here. It's been, my wife and I came through a couple of years ago on a trip going north, and then a few years before that, we stopped by on a trip going south. But it's been wonderful to be back and to go through that snow squall coming up from Window Rock this afternoon. It was really nice. And I always like that drive from Window Rock up to here to see as the elevation changes, how the vegetation changes. So I'm really honored to be back here. I began my teaching career by accident here at what was then called the Navajo Community College back in 1984. I had graduated in 1982 back in the Jurassic Age and had studied under Vine Deloria Jr. And David Bibeehaz'áanii was one of my colleagues in the program that Vine Deloria had started. It was the first master's program in federal Indian policy and law. And David and I got through the program together, and I also roomed with a Navajo gentleman, Ronald Haven, who became an attorney, and he worked for the Navajo Nation for many years until he retired. But I had stopped back by after I'd moved back to Arizona in 1984 just to visit and say hello to David because we had been good friends. And he asked me what I was going to do now that I was here. And I said, well, I don't know. I'm going to have to find a job. He said, how would you like to come work here at NCC? I said, doing what? He said, teaching, of course. I said, geez, I never thought about being a teacher. He said, well, why don't you could do some curriculum development for us one semester, and then we'll slide you into a teaching position. And that's how it worked out. My first course was a course Navajo history from pre-contact to present. I was very nervous, walked into that class of 35 Navajo students, and there I was, a non-Navajo, going to teach them about their history. So it was really a daunting assignment, but they were kind to me, and we worked together closely and got through that course. And I really relished the 3.5 years I spent here. And so I get back whenever I can, and I'm really happy to be here now. My first wife was Navajo. She was from Red Lake chapter. And our first son was born here, well, actually down in Chenli, which had the clinic. He was born there in 1984. So this really is a special place to me for lots of reasons. And then, of course, when my son came of age, we had 2 other children. And of course, when they got ready to go to school, they had to choose a tribe, right? You can only legally belong to one tribe, according to most tribes. And so, of course, they all chose Navajo because Navajos are matrilineal society. So we had created some Navabes rather than Lumjos. So that kind of broke my heart a little bit, but I accepted it. I wasn't in law, and no, it's worked out. It worked out really fine. But along with Vine and the other great instructors at the University of Arizona, including Tom Holm at Cherokee Creek, I had really got to know lots of good people in that program. And when I was first hired here, I was tasked with teaching Navajo government, and that was the course that introduced me to the topic of Diné politics and Diné governance. And so when you are assigned a new course, you begin to do the research because you got to prepare the syllabus, right? And so I did a deep search, went down to the library, checked out many sources, and discovered there wasn't a whole lot that had been written about the Navajo governing system. And so I decided, after teaching the Diné government course for a couple of times, I said, why don't I write the book about Diné government? And so Anna Walters was then head of NCC Press. She was married to Harry Walters, who used to run the museum here. And she was excited about that book. And so over the course of a year or so, I drafted it. And this is what came out, this little pancake book. Really just a handbook, right? Because that's all it is a handbook. And a handbook does nothing more than introduce someone to a subject, right? It's not a definitive study by any stretch of the imagination. And so it was important that I remember that, because I knew at some point I would want to update it as I learned more about the Diné political system and Diné culture and so on. And so I did that. And then, of course, while I was doing the writing of this book, it became clear to me that I needed to return to school to get my PhD. Deloria reminded me that we needed more natives in the academy, teaching social sciences, political science, sociology, geography, and so on. And while I hated leaving this country, even though it would take me back to North Carolina, back to UNC Chapel Hill, it was necessary. And so I left, and this book was nearly done. And when I applied to a graduate program at Chapel Hill, I had taken the GRE, the Graduate Record Examination, and I bombed it. I think I scored the lowest score ever imagined by anybody. But I had great letters of recommendation from Vine Delory and Tom Holm and others. And this little book had just come out. And so the admissions committee said, well, if he can write a book, maybe he can survive our rigorous PhD program. And so that's how I got into the PhD program. I'm sure I wouldn't have been admitted had I not did this book. And so I really thank Anna Walters for giving me the opportunity to write that. And it's been a wonderful book to work on and revise several times. The next time I did it was also with NCC Press, and it came out looking like this in 1999. And I had changed the title because I had wanted it to be a broader and deeper account of Diné governing institutions and political dynamics in Diné society. And so this came out in 99. And then, of course, governments continue to grow. They continue to face new problems, new issues. And so in 2003, I think it was, I did another edition in this lovely color, the Navajo Political Experience, and had made additional changes, which I'll talk about momentarily. And then, as Wendy mentioned, the most recent edition was this one, which came out in 2013. And now we're in the process of doing a 5th edition. The publisher contacted me last year and said that the book was still selling a little bit on the reservation in adjacent areas. And he asked me if I would be interested in doing an update. I hadn't continued my research on Navajo politics since I was doing other things. But I decided that I would look into it if I could find a Diné co-author. And so I had just given a talk at UNM and had got to know Tiffany Lee and Wendy Gray Eyes, and I had already met Lloyd Lee at a couple of occasions. And so I asked them if they would consider joining me for this next edition. And fortunately, they said yes. So they're working on their updates to the book. And then when they finish those sometime this year, they'll turn it over to me, and then I will add my 2 cents worth. And hopefully by the end of the year, sometime in 2025, we'll have a 5th edition. And it will be a much better book because it has Diné authors now. And they'll provide the perspective that I could not do as an in-law, or I now an ex-law, or an outlaw, I guess, right? I'm an outlaw, right? So it's going to be wonderful, and I'm looking forward. I'm very excited to see the changes that Wendy and Tiffany and Lloyd have made, and I'm really terribly excited about that. So you can see as the book has grown, it has gotten thicker and wider, not unlike me. When I first wrote it, I was fairly skinny, and now I'm fat, and the book is a little bit fatter. And I expect this next edition will be even a little more weighty, and I'm looking forward to working on that. Now, when the book was first published in '87, the subtitle, as I said, was a Handbook of Navajo Government because it wasn't an exhaustive study. But it at least provided a contemporary account of Diné government, and it described basic Diné political history and the intergovernmental relationship between the Navajo Nation and the federal government. And since I'm trained as a political scientist, I also address the powers of indigenous nations, describe the basic functions of government in general, outlined the historical evolution of the Diné and broader indigenous federal relationship, detailed the growth of Diné government from pre-contact to the late 20th century, and described and analyzed the scope and structure of the Diné political system. And when I finally had a chance to revise it the first time in '99, my aim was to deepen it and broaden it, making it more functional and useful for the readers. A great deal had occurred since 2000, in the 12 years since the book had first come out, including McDonald's corruption scandal that rocked the nation and led to considerable changes in Diné governance, a deadly outbreak of the mystery illness, also known as the hantavirus. Some of you remember that, right? It caused a real scare, didn't it, on the reservation? And the visitation of 2 Diné deities to an elder, another important development in the evolution of the Navajo people. The ongoing impact of the Navajo-Hopi land dispute, which continued to cause problems, and the Bennett Freeze land situation over out there near Tuba City. And the publication of some new research on Diné history by Peter Iverson, Emily Benedict, and others. So a lot had changed in that in the years after the first edition came out. The book was renamed and expanded to include all the new developments in Diné governance, including amendments to Title II, a clearer separation of powers, which was important as the nation transitioned to becoming truly a more democratic body, rather than a body led by and dominated by the executive branch under McDonald. A split and renaming of the position of chairman into 2 new positions, the Speaker of the Council and the President of the Navajo Nation, right? Those are huge changes in the Navajo Nation's evolution. And I also included new materials that focused on the dynamics of Diné governance, including the role of interest groups, the continuing important role of the media, the electoral process, how elections are conducted on the reservation, and a policy portfolio that focused on the land disputes, the then unsuccessful efforts by the Navajo government to institute gaming, which eventually they just sort of went around the people and started it themselves, right? And taxation, a critical area of Native governance that is still largely underexplored by many nations, except for the Navajo. The Navajo Nation has the most sophisticated and the most impressive taxation scheme of any Native nation that I'm aware of. A number of new appendices were added, providing lots of additional information, including a timeline, copies of the nation's 2 ratified treaties, 1851 and 1868, the Navajo Nation's Bill of Rights, the Title II amendments of 1989, and the very important Local Governance Act of 1998, in which the Navajo Nation was trying to decentralize and return some power to the chapter governments. And they haven't really been quite as successful in that as I would like to see, but they are still trying to do that. So as y'all continue to reform and grow in very interesting ways, The two later editions incorporated additional events that occurred between 1999 and 2013. First, a number of grassroots Diné organizations had formed, and they successfully pressed for critical changes in Navajo governance. In fact, for the first time in modern history in 2009, the Diné people's voice was formally heard on the structure of their governing body. Right? It wasn't until 2009 that you, the people, had a voice on how the Navajo Nation's governance was formed, or in the process actually of being reformed. Second, the Navajo Nation Council was dramatically reduced from 88 members down to 24. And this is the first and only known account that I am aware of a Native government reducing the size of its council rather than increasing its size, right? So that process of streamlining has had both benefits and some problems, right, that have been generated by that reduction. And that's one reason I'm looking forward to see what we can learn, how things have developed over the last few years. And the Navajo Nation finally decided, after multiple attempts, to institutionalize gaming within and near reservation borders. And there was also a tense governing crisis between the legislative branch, the executive branch, and the judiciary. And that led to precedent-setting Navajo Supreme Court rulings that reminded the political branches, that is the president and his branch and the council, that the people and their historic traditions, values, and principles reigned supreme. So there were two major decisions in 2010 that really reaffirmed the popular sovereignty, the people sovereignty of the Diné people, and not the sovereignty of governing elites. And then there was a majority of council members and the vice president and former president who were charged with fraud, forgery, conspiracy, and theft. At one point, virtually every member of the council was charged with those crimes. So it tells you that governments wax and wane, right, in terms of their ability to negotiate and follow the rule of law. And sometimes we do it very well, and sometimes we have some real hiccups. And that was certainly the case during the time I was doing the fourth edition. But on a positive note, the Navajo Nation created the Indigenous Human Rights Commission, the first of any Indigenous nation to do so. Claudine Arthur Bates was named the first female Chief Justice in 2003, a major milestone. And the nation became much more actively involved in international affairs as it looked to expand its connections both culturally and economically with other nations around the globe. So the nation continues to expand its intergovernmental relationship with other polities, not just states and the federal government, but other nations and other indigenous nations around the world. So as I said, at this very moment, Wendy, Tiffany, and Lloyd are doing their part to update the book, addressing and analyzing the many changes that have transpired since 2013. And there have been many. And after they've done their work, they'll turn it over to me, and I'll add my political and legal updates. I just stopped by the Navajo Times in Window Rock on my way up this afternoon and talked with the marketing, what was her title? Yeah, I can't remember title, but she takes care of all the back issues. And I asked her if she would to put together a set of the year-end annual reviews that the Times does, right? In which they highlight all the major developments in the year. Those were very helpful to me in all the previous iterations of the book to get me quickly up to speed on major developments that had transpired. So I'm looking forward to doing that and looking forward to seeing all the things that have happened. So with that, as a broad sort of overview of sort of walking down memory lane, as Wendy so gracefully put it, I'm looking forward now to the next steps of more futuristically seeing where the book's going to go, right? And once the next edition is out, I'm going to turn over the copyright proofs, permissions, and give those to my Navajo co-authors so they can continue the book as they see fit down the road. That book belongs on the reservation, and it belongs to be led and written by Navajos going forward. So with that, I want to just finally emphasize two things that I've been thinking about. I've been thinking about these for a long time, but especially when Wendy invited me to come back here. And the first one, I was happy to learn that there have been discussions as recently as 2018, and Mr. Lermer can help me out here, in reviving, resuscitating NCC Press, Diné Press. And I don't know where that is at. I want to hear more about that. But Wendy and I were talking about that during her podcast this afternoon. I really hope that that goes through. We talked about the importance of nations producing their own histories, their own political science books, their own cultural studies, their own educational and linguistic curriculum. And when NCC Press was in its heyday, that's what it did. And it gave me an opportunity as a Native scholar to write my first book, right? And this book opened a lot of doors for me that would not have been opened otherwise. So I highly encourage the college and the nation to work together to find a way to get the press back under work, because it's really important that take place, because it's a way for new knowledge to be produced by Diné people themselves and allies of the Diné that the Diné trust, right? Because we know we need allies from other nations to work with us on certain issues. So I'm really happy about that and hope that continues. And then secondarily, I want to talk a little bit about the need for a national archive. And I've heard, just since I've been talking to Wendy over these last couple of weeks, and then this afternoon, when I went over to visit the librarians who had helped me for many years while I was here, and then after I left here, and they mentioned the archive building that's over here, right? But apparently it has not quite been gotten underway. And I want to highly and really strongly encourage you to do that. I actually wrote Cheryl Crazybull, who heads up the American Indian Higher Education Consortium, or the American Indian College Fund, to ask her if there were any other tribal nations that have archives. To my knowledge, the only one that has one are the Eastern Band of Cherokee in North Carolina and the Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma. And if you ever get a chance to visit their archives, they're splendid repositories of most of or much of the documentary evidence that provides them a foundation on which they can continue to build and rebuild their nations. Every indigenous nation needs to have its own archives. And the Navajo Nation is well established, and it needs to have that as well. In fact, Vine Deloria, in one of his articles way back in 1978, wrote a piece that was simply titled A Right to Know. And in that piece, he urged tribal nations to take charge of gathering all the materials that are relevant to their nation's past, present, and future, and to put them, create an archives that's protected, that's well-funded, and that's well established, so that we can have all the materials on treaties, agreements, statutes, work on education, etc., to continue to build the intellectual sovereignty that we need that will be the foundation on which we can develop policies and laws and norms to guide our nations forward. I know I was really impressed when I know that the Diné Policy Institute was first established. When was that first set up here, Michael?
Maybe 2006.
Yeah.
Like that.
I was so impressed by that. And when I was doing the last edition of the book, I came here to meet with the members who were leading the Diné Policy Institute, and they had prepared several reports that were fantastic. Those are the kind of reports that need to be published, right? That need to see the light of day at both the tribal level, the regional level, the state level, and the national level, because it's the production of new knowledge that can really form the foundation. And so Delory really emphasized that. And in fact, he had referenced a law and that dates back to 1866. This was a law that Congress enacted, and it's called simply a resolution for supplying the Choctaw, Cherokee, and Chickasaw nations with copies of the laws. And here's what the law says. This is 1866, folks. It says, resolved by the Senate and House of Representatives of the United States that the Choctaw, Cherokee, and Chickasaw Indians, nations of Indians, through their such agent as they may delegate, be furnished by the Secretary of the Interior with such copies or volumes of the laws of the United States, journals of Congress, and documents printed by order of Congress as are supplied to the states and territories of the United States. So the leaders of those three tribes had convinced Congress that they also should receive copies of all the laws that are produced by the United States, because many of those laws impact us, don't they? And so the Navajo Nation needs to have that same kind of access to all the laws that have been produced historically and contemporarily. So you can add those to your archives and all the documents that the Navajo Nation itself produces, right? And build that up in your archive so that that material can be available to present and future scholars and students so that we can continue the reconstruction of our nations as we move forward in the 21st century. Thank you very much.
Do we have any questions from anybody in the audience? Let me, is there an extra?
Hi, hello, my name is Tyler.
Hi.
And I'm not the management, and the line that the question change. And the foundation said, oh, I've got my daughter. I'd like to say, thank you for sharing that with us. I read your book. It's really thought-provoking. It gave me a lot of insight on our political process. So the question I have here kind of relates to our American Indian Religious Freedom Act of 1994, the illegal amendment. With regards to that, will that particular amendment be included in your 5th edition with what's going on right now in terms of peyote decriminalization? And with regards to that as well, will the Diné experience with this peyote decriminalization be included, being I guess our key players in this peyote decriminalization movement would be Azeb and Diné Nation and our Diné chapters of NAC of North America. I'd just like your take on that.
Yeah.
That's a big movement going on.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And Indigenous peoples face more religious constraints than any other ethnic group in this country. We all know about the sacred sites problems that many Native nations face, including the Navajo Nation over the Snow Bowl, right, in Flagstaff, and other sacred sites. In fact, Winnie and I were talking during the broadcast about that wonderful documentary that Melinda Maynor Lowry and one other person put together, In the Light of Reverence. It talks about 3 sacred sites, conflict areas, one over Bears Lodge on Devil's Tower in Wyoming, one involving the California tribe, Northern California, and the other involving the Hopi Nation and the struggles they have trying to protect their sacred sites. But you could extrapolate that across Indian country because many Native nations continue to struggle having their rights to practice their religion, whether it's peyote or traditional Diné religion or anything else. Christian religion is pretty well protected in this country, right? Notwithstanding what members of Donald Trump's cult talk about. But if you're a Christian, a native, you can pretty much do your thing or wherever you want to do that. But if you follow traditional ways, traditional laws, and need access to sacred sites, and if you follow the peyote way, even though that has been decriminalized, that doesn't mean it's not going to be recriminalized at some point, because federal policy waxes and wanes in terms of how much support it provides for religious rights for Indigenous peoples, depending on who's sitting on the Supreme Court, depending on who's sitting in the White House, and depending on who's sitting in the congressional chambers. So we can never take our religions for granted because have never been guaranteed, because our rights have been framed outside of the constitutional structure, because we exist as pre- and extra-constitutional sovereigns. And as Clarence Thomas said in one of his opinions in U.S. versus Law, the U.S. Constitution doesn't protect tribes. And he's right? Because if it did, we wouldn't have had 109 tribes terminated in the 1950s and 1960s. So we know that, which is one reason we need to codify and develop our own governing systems and make them as strong and as robust as possible. And one of the ways to do that is to make sure that our religious rights are protected. So I'm going to see that we include, well, there will certainly be discussion about religious issues in the book, because that continues to be an ongoing struggle, right? And the whole issue about water for life, right? Standing Rock, and the oil problems and pipelines and so on, all that's related to religious freedom or the lack thereof for indigenous peoples. And so that will be worked into the book, I'm sure, in some form or another. Thank you for that question. Yes.
Yes, okay, thank you. My name's Carla Brayton. I was wondering, you brought up water. Could you talk a little bit about the US Supreme Court's ruling against the Navajo Nation and water rights that happened just last June?
Yeah, that was a devastating case. I was one of I was part of a small group of attorneys who wrote an amicus brief to the Supreme Court. And we tried to make the argument, the very sensible argument, that the 1851 and 1868 treaties guaranteed the Navajo Nation and its citizens and their lands adequate water to take care of their people's needs. Then the Supreme Court rejected that argument. But just sitting in the Navajo Times office this afternoon while I was waiting to meet with Ron and Joe, I picked up this week's Navajo Times. And apparently the Navajo Nation is working in an ongoing water settlement with many parties, including states, private individuals, and others, so that the Navajo Nation water rights will finally have some kind of codified protection. And I haven't kept up with that issue on that side from a political standpoint, but that would certainly be an issue that I want to investigate more. But when they lost the Supreme Court decision last year, I knew they were going to lose that because all the markings are on the wall, and 6 of the 9 Supreme Court justices do not care for indigenous sovereignty. They don't care for indigenous governance. And so for them, they engage in a balancing test. And the balancing test is always, how is this going to impact states and the majority population, as opposed to how is it going to impact indigenous population, right? We're 2% of the population. And when the Supreme Court uses a balancing test, we almost always are on the wrong side of the balancing scale, right? Because we're such a small number, notwithstanding the importance of our ongoing treaty rights, right? And so you can, even when you have the law on your side, that doesn't mean that the right is going to be upheld, as it wasn't in the case of the water rights litigation. Yeah, devastating case. Yeah. Yeah.
Do you have any pedagogical goals for this new edition, or any tools that you're working on to really make it usable for Navajo students?
Well, that's one reason I brought on my 3 Navajo co-authors. They had sent me an outline of the changes that they intend to make. I don't have them with me right now. Maybe Wendy, maybe you can speak to some of the things that you're working on, including in the book, because I haven't seen those yet. So maybe now would be a good time to tell us a little bit about that.
So I think just in the general overview, we're actually adding more updated events that are happening, because the last time this book was published was in 2013. So a lot has happened.
Mhm.
So when you think about the pedagogical aspect, it is still retaining that chronological structure, but also there is still kind of the end of each chapter provides like reading suggestions, but also some questions for students to process. So, but I know in David Nez's class, we used the book extensively, so it definitely did inform a lot of our foundational thinking about fundamental law, which I feel like that's where the story ended here. But how has fundamental law actually been played out within the courtrooms, just between families, and even within the Navajo Nation Council? So there's a lot of that needs to be addressed.
Right, very good. Thank you. Yeah.
I have a question. Yate, Shay, Tristan Black, leadership, and I'm a community member at Tsaile, but I'm also here with Mr. Sosi, Harrison Sosi, and I'm a policy analyst with the Office of Navajo Government Development. And I know that's a critical part of the book, where you talk a little bit about the Shirley versus Morgan decision,
Right.
and how that played a role for the Navajo Government Reform Project.
Mhm.
So the office now is getting focused back on those 1989 amendments
Okay.
and how the office moves forward. So I was curious,
throughout the various editions, what role do you see Navajo people being a part of that Navajo government reform project? And what are some key attributes, I guess? Because one of the big words we hear a lot is democracy. What does democracy mean for a lot of our native nations, but specifically our Diné Nation too?
Yeah. That's a good question, and that's one area I'm looking forward when they finish their work and it comes to me. That's one of the areas I want to look at to see what your office has been doing over these last 10 years or so, and see what kind of changes have unfurled. Right now, I can't speak to that because I haven't kept up with it. But in terms of democracy, what we know is that indigenous peoples were the most egalitarian, peoples in the world, and indigenous peoples around the world are like that, where the people and the earth are the sovereign, and the elites, the leaders that we put into positions of authority, merely reflect our sovereignty, right? They're not the font, they're not the basis of that sovereignty. The people are the sovereign. And for indigenous peoples, the ultimate sovereign is the earth, right? Because we follow the rhythms of the land and we try to create governing systems and follow norms and values and principles that reflect our relationship to the earth and the species that constitute the earth. And that's where, when the fundamental law was first enacted, and when I saw that it wasn't being easily accepted by the political branches, right? It was the judicial branch that really sort of pushed that through. And when they had the conflicts in the early 2000s, it caused a real rift between the three branches, right? And that's why I'm anxious to see what's happened since then, because I don't know where things stand at the moment. Winnie could speak more to that than I could right now, simply because I haven't kept up with it. But I think those two opinions in 2010 really provided an absolute powerful foundation on which the Navajo Nation could move forward, by reminding all the political elites, all the chapter heads, all the Navajo Nation council members, the president, and everybody else in the executive branch, that popular sovereignty rests within the people. And they need to follow the rules and the dictates and the values that the Navajo people themselves put forward. So I think that's what should be the driving impetus for any kind of changes as you move forward. Yeah.
Yeah, Chair Harrison Associate Chair. I'm from working as the executive director for the Office of Navajo Government.
Oh, yeah.
And previously I served as the Deputy Attorney General for about 8 years and Attorney General with the Ben Shelley administration.
Okay.
So a lot of the activities
Mm.
that have recently
Right.
my name is probably somewhere in the background. Nevertheless, the recognition that we have is that the current Navajo Nation government has been in existence for about 100 years now, since 1923.
Right.
And during that period of time, the issue that you mentioned in your book about legitimacy, because the Navajo people have never approved the current structure of government, other than when we go to elections every 4 years.
Right.
That's really not approval. But nevertheless, what we see is that the current government, as instituted by the federal government, our own government has taken away many of our rights, like our land rights. Now they get home site leases, business site leases, and so forth.
Right.
And even our water, they claim it as theirs. So this is in violation of the Treaty of 1868, because we reserved the right to use and occupy.
Right.
And then we said that it would not be transferred without 3/4 approval of the adult males and so forth. So I always say, how did our government all of a sudden get the consent authority to manage the land, to say it's theirs,
Yeah.
to say that the water is theirs, but in reality, it belongs to the people.
Yeah.
So those are the kinds of questions I have as to whether or not the book will bring out that kind of recognition and say that there's unresolved issues. And then in this 100 years of governance under the federal government's government, what do we as Navajo people need to do to put in our own government.
Right.
Rather than living with what the federal government handed us.
Excellent. I appreciate that overview. And I'm really looking forward to seeing exactly what's happened since the book came out in 2013. You're right. I think some of the changes that were instituted in the wake of McDonald's, terrible regime that led to the changes and separation finally of the executive branch from the legislative branch were very important. But you're right about that most important and most fundamental question of legitimacy and the right of consent of the people, right? Because if people have not consented, then the government by definition is not legitimate, right? And so you're making the argument, and as I made it in the previous editions of this book, that the Navajo Nation still has not met that, that signal. And I know there've been strides made in that direction, and yet, since I haven't kept up with it, I don't know. So I'm looking forward to reading some of the work that you probably produced, you and your office, and seeing exactly what Wendy and Tiffany and Lloyd come up with, and doing my own deep dive into it and seeing what we can come up with. But that's definitely going to be a key question that is at the forefront of my mind as the book moves forward, right? How democratic is the Diné Nation today, right? And is it sticking true to the principles that were outlined by your founding fathers and mothers and grandmothers and grandfathers, right? Because if it isn't, then something has to change. Yeah.
They gave me the mic, so I guess I better.
Oh, yeah, right.
Yeah, from the Burbecha tribe. You mentioned a little bit about, well, everybody's mentioned a little bit about fundamental law as enacted by the Navajo Nation Council, as put forth by the judiciary branch. And if you guys look closely at it, there's a section that talks about the implementation of a 4-branch government. And it's kind of, people have been ignoring it forever, except us academics. We know exactly what it says. We have nothing better to do, and nobody listens to us. But that's part of the question. There's a section on, if I remember it correctly, it would be something like the emergency management branch of the Navajo Nation that does not exist at this time, and would likely come into conflict, of course, with the appearance that the Navajo Nation could potentially be militarizing itself in opposition to a colonial actor. I wonder if you had any exposure to that. Maybe it's a question for your new co-authors, which I love this idea. How would the Navajo Nation even begin to hold the leadership accountable for the creation of these branches and put them to work? Yeah. Again, it's premature for me to respond to that because I haven't kept up with the deep affairs of the Diné government over the last 10, 12 years. But I'm anxious to get my hands on some of the reports that your office has prepared, and to go back and study the fundamental law again, and seeing what my co-authors come up with. Because I remember I was impressed initially with the fundamental law, right? Because I think it was clearly a move in the right direction, but I haven't kept it with it enough to know whether it's gone far enough and what's missing, what hasn't been implemented yet. So I got a lot of work I need to do between now and when the book is published to see exactly where things stand. But we know Native governments have gone through a tremendous amount of change in the last century. And you're right, 2023, 1923, like 100 years plus one, right? Now that we're in 2024. My book on Native governments just came out, and I do a broad overview of all indigenous governments. Over 500 of them operate under constitutions now. 60 of them predate the IRA and John Collier.
but the rest of them have been produced since then. Many of those constitutions really do come from the ground up. Others are driven from the top down by elites wanting to codify positions of authority that they already possess, right? And we see what's happening at the national level right now with the Constitution. And this is the United States poised to either continue on as a democracy or head toward autocracy, right? And yet the Constitution has remained, right? But it's all about how that is interpreted and how it's practiced, right? Is it embedded in the hearts and souls of every American? And clearly it isn't right now, because the country is divided in a profound manner. And I know the Navajo Nation, with 400,000 plus citizens, you are the most diverse, all right, of any indigenous nation, right? With many different interest groups, all desiring certain things. Sometimes they collaborate, sometimes they are in conflict. And so we're going to be working to try and craft a book that reflects all these ongoing issues and raise questions about what would be best for the Diné people and the Diné lands that the people depend upon, and try and do that in such a way that it will be of benefit to everybody who picks it up and reads it. Yeah.
My name is Lyle Log. I'm a student here at Diné College, and I'm going to be graduating soon with a Diné Studies degree. And I have a question that I've been thinking about, sitting here listening to some of the questions that are being brought up. Like there was a gentleman that brought up the one on peyote decriminalization, and then of course sacred sites, what you were talking about, for example, Bears Ears in Utah, right? And how the federal government is trying to, go in there and extract, natural resources, not considering that, these are our Native American spiritual sites.
Right.
So I'm wondering, in your book, are you going to highlight those areas utilizing the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples? I think that's a really good document.
Right.
And of course, I think you know this as well, but it was drafted in 1976 and then approved finally in 2013. And I was really surprised that the United States and Australia were the last two
Right.
to sign that document.
Right.
So to me, that means this document could be something that could be very useful in voicing our opinions and our rights as indigenous people. So I just wondered if you could be including that in your upcoming literature as well. Yeah,
definitely. The United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples was adopted in 2007, actually. And it was ratified by over 135 or 140 nations. The last four that held out were Canada, the US, New Zealand, and Australia. And the United States was the last one to sign on. Obama finally signed on to it in 2010. That's a critically important document. Unfortunately, it's not a binding international treaty, right? It provides more customary law and recognition of the rights of indigenous peoples. And so far, it hasn't been really incorporated very much in the United Nations. There are certain legal interest groups that work for Native nations that are trying to get elements of it introduced into their local and states and areas. But Canada is farther ahead in terms of incorporating elements of it into their national law. And portions on countries like Bolivia and some other countries like New Zealand have also found ways to incorporate elements of it into their national law. The United States has done very little in that sense. But that's not to say that natives aren't trying to get it incorporated, right? But since it's not a binding treaty, it's difficult to get that enforced. And given the state of the current U.S. Supreme Court, and particularly if Donald Trump gets reelected to the presidency, we can put that on hold for the next 4 years, right? Assuming we survive for another 4 years. But I think it lays out in beautiful language what could really improve dramatically the relationship between indigenous peoples around the world and the states that that surround them. But it's going to be difficult for us to get that document formally accepted into state law and federal law in this country until dramatic changes take place in the public attitudes of Americans about indigenous rights and in the minds of lawmakers in all three branches at the state and federal level. So we've got our work cut out for us, which is why we've got to keep working both internally and externally, right? My wife and I are starting another book in which we're examining the relationship between Native nations and state governments, right? And we're going to focus a good chunk of that book on the role that Native state lawmakers have played in trying to strengthen Native sovereignty. And the Navajo Nation has produced a number of Native state lawmakers over the years. I interviewed Jack Jackson 10, 12 years ago when he was in State House, and several other Native lawmakers. My wife worked for the National Conference of State Lawmakers, and she knows many of them. And so we're going to write this book because those Native state lawmakers played and continue to play a pivotal role in balancing the districts that they represent, sometimes Native dominated, sometimes not, with the interests of the nation that they are a part of, right? And so they are sort of unsung heroes in our book in terms of protecting the remaining rights of our nations. So we've got to focus internally, dealing with issues like that, and externally with the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and try to create a pincher effect and force the United States of America to finally abide by the rule of law and the rule of justice. Yeah.
Well, I got two questions, one from Dr. Jennifer Diné, and then the other from President Russell. This first one is about when you were publishing the book, the handbook, the Diné Bibeehaz'áanii. During this time, you published at Tribal College Press was so relatively new. How is publishing a book by Navajo Community College Press perceived by other scholars?
I think they were very impressed by that, and the fact that that NCC Press even existed was a shock to many natives that I met, especially when this book came out and I ran around showing everybody, because I was so proud of it, right? And a lot of them didn't know that the college had its own press and was producing lots of work, right? Building upon the good work that Rough Rock did and some of the other demonstration schools, right? And that's where the whole idea for indigenous publication began, at those demonstration schools. And then fortunately, people here at the college picked that up and created NCC Press. And so it was very impressive. And I don't know of any other tribal college that has its own press. I know that they sometimes produce curriculum materials for specific courses, but to actually produce books that are published and distributed widely, I don't know of any. And so I strongly encourage, the leadership here and the student body to really put pressure on the Board of Regents and the president to get the press underway again, so that students and faculty and staff can have an outlet for their work to make things happen and get that new knowledge out there that can really benefit all of us. Yeah.
Well, thank you for that. And this next question, I actually got quite a bit of questions from Jennifer Diné, Dr. Diné. But I just wanted to give a little context. Dr. Diné is actually in the process of leading the development of a tribal government textbook for high school students. And you guys may have heard the press releases out there. And so this question is really coming from that perspective of contributions to scholarship around the Diné Nation. But she asks, what do you see differently in terms of the core to Diné Nation building as a political scientist? What is our core as a Diné Nation?
What is the core?
Looking at it from a political scientist perspective, I guess. So you put that hat on.
It goes back to the two terms we were just talking about, legitimacy and consent, right? Because historically, we know, in fact, you could throw in the word consensus along with those two terms, right? Because historically, the Diné communities operated on the principle of consensus rather than majority rule, right? You talked an issue until people agreed to it, right? And if there were dissenters, the dissenters got up and left, and they would go do their own thing, right? But the ones that remained were then committed to it, right? And so the issue of legitimacy and consent are connected to consensus as well. And so I think those are absolutely important. And the book that you're talking about, that Jennifer is doing, I was really glad to hear that, because we need curriculum materials studying Diné governance from elementary all the way through high school, right? And continuing on into college, which is where this one was born, right? We need all that curriculum material. But if they could get a good grounding in Diné governance in high school, they would be better prepared to go to college, whether it's to come here or ASU or BYU or U of A or wherever they wanted to come. The University of Richmond is a place you might want to consider, at some point. But there are lots of schools that are out there. So I'm looking forward to seeing that book in print. And I'm looking to learn what each of the authors are going to say in the respective chapters they're working on. But it's all about those core fundamental political principles that are rooted in the values and the traditions of the Diné people themselves that have to form the foundation on which any political system is constructed. Otherwise, it's not going to last. It's not going to endure.
Well, I actually have a question that came in on Facebook Live from a student. Two-part question. First, what advice would Dr. Wilkins give the young Native American political scientists? By the way, the gentleman's name is Damon Clark. And the second, what is his favorite Navajo food?
Navajo taco, of course. Now go back to the first. What was the first question again?
What advice would Dr. Wilkins give to young Native political scientists?
Oh, just read everything you can find and write as much as you can. We're not producing enough writers, and now that AI is out there, I find a number of my students at the UR turning to AI to write drafts of their papers, right? To write their arguments about I'm concerned about our ability to craft original, investigative, hard-hitting, evidence-based reports that will provide useful information for our people and for our communities. When I first signed up, when I became a student of Vine Delorious, my first semester as a graduate student, he taught a course on Indian treaties. We walked into the class, there were 15 of us who signed up for the class. Most of them were PhD students, and there were 3 or 4 of us master's students. And he handed out the syllabus, and it was about yay thick, about as thick as this handbook. And he went through it. And the main assignment was to write 3 25-page term papers in that one class. I had never written more than a single 20-page paper for one class. And he wanted us to do 3 in that one class. And we had other classes that we were taking too, right? And I was so excited to do that. But as soon as he read that part of class, literally half the class got up and walked out, right? They did. And they never came back. And I dove into it. I barely survived that semester. I wound up pitching a tent in the library, claiming it under doctrine of discovery. And I just buried myself in there, right? And it took every ounce of my energy to finish that 3rd paper. And after each one, you turn it in, and he would write these detailed 2 or 3-page single-space critiques of what you had written. And I still return to those when I'm getting ready to start a new writing project, just to be reminded of what I need to do as a writer, as a researcher. And having survived that course, I knew I could survive any course that was thrown at me. And it followed me, and it guided me through that master's program and to my PhD at Chapel Hill too. So find the courses that are the most difficult, that are the most demanding, the ones that expect you to write and read the most. Take those courses and learn everything that you can, and then a little bit more, because it's going to take all that energy and all that knowledge to continue to deal with the problems that we have to face as Native peoples. Yeah.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that.
So did you invent the land back movement then?
Yeah. So yeah, AI is like the new threat to tribal sovereignty. It's kind of scary.
Yeah.
Well, I just want to say thank you so much. I don't know if you have any closing comments or anything for everyone who showed up? Because I know there's a lot of people who want to have burning questions for you, that we want to ask you. So I'll go ahead and leave that time for that. So if you have any closing
I just want to thank you all for coming. I really appreciate it. Thank you for having this college. Thank you for giving me a chance to begin my career here. It's been a blessing ever since I left, and I get back as often as I can. Thank you very much.
Yay. All right. Get the batteries going out on this thing, so.
There you
But
go.
just really quickly, I just want to thank everyone who make these events possible. Just want to give a thank you to our dean, Dr. Carla Britton, who's really been the driver behind the Mellon Foundation grant that funds this initiative. But also I want to give a shout out to students from Columbia, right? They showed up today, and I guess you guys are doing some work at Round Rock, right? I know Sam Slater is currently the president of the Diné Studies Conference Incorporated, so I know his home community, right, is being visited by you guys. Are you guys all in the field of architecture? Okay, yay, I got it right. But thank you and thank you for joining us today. I also want to thank Kayla for being a really good coordinator and doing all the back end of this. I want to say thank you to Dylan and Hanson and Kevin, who do a lot of the technological back end as well. But in terms of our next book talk, we weren't able to get Mr. Blackhawk. But we just learned about this beautiful book. That's just still not available yet, but it's from Dr. Renee Watchman. She's publishing a book that's coming out March 18th. It's titled From the Nits'áá to the Nenda, and it's restoring relations through stories. So this book will be published through the University of Arizona Press, and she'll be here April 18th from 5 to 6:30 p.m. So we hope you guys do return and join us for some of the delicious food. So please, guys, take some food. You see there's a lot of leftovers, but I am really grateful for everybody for joining us. Thank you.
Thank you. And this is yours.
Yes.
All right, will do.
Yeah, so there's-
Is the video up? Yeah, this is.
We won't tell.
Yeah.